Hello and welcome to another episode of the ShareTech podcast, InfoSec with the three Hacketeers. And the Hacketeers we have here today are myself, Josh, Jose, and Crane. And we're here to talk to you about whitelisting and blacklisting when it comes to software that your organization uses. Josh, if you want to take it away, give us a little intro of what is software whitelisting or what is software blacklisting.
Sure thing, Sid. Yeah, so fundamentally, whitelisting and blacklisting is two sides of the same coin. You're getting at the same thing, which is controlling, in the case of software, controlling what software is being used. And you do it one of two ways. You either do what's called whitelisting, which is where you everything's prohibited except what's on the whitelist, and that's your exceptions. So you might hear people talk about deny all, permit by exception. That's a whitelist. A blacklist is the other way. You allow everything that isn't on the list, the blacklist. So everything's good unless you're on a blacklist. So that would be some, for software, a whitelist would be you use, Office 365 productivity software, you use this line of business application, this one, and that's it. Blacklist is you can use anything you want, but don't use, peer-to-peer file sharing software.
So to be very clear, the whitelist is whenever everything is blocked and you have to manually open up the ability for X, Y, Z applications to be used, and blacklisting is the opposite, where everything is you can use anything and everything you want, but if we put an item on the blacklist, it is unusable. Correct?
Yep, that's it exactly.
So now that we know what whitelisting and blacklisting is, could we review the pros and cons of each one, Josh?
Sure thing. So predominantly, whitelisting is often the preferred one because it's usually the shorter list, right? It's usually easier to list the things that are allowed and deny everything else. So we talked about, software, right? So if you have a company and you're giving people laptops, you're going to tell them, like, this is our software suite, right? And these are the programs that we utilize, and we're going to get you an account. We're going to get you logged into, Slack, Teams, get you an Outlook email, get you into, Salesforce or like a finance program. It's usually much shorter to do that. Firewalls are the same way, right? Firewalls block everything, and then you open it up. You open the firewall to just what you need. So that's the advantage of whitelisting. Is generally that's shorter. Particularly when we come to software, that's where sometimes organizations want to do it the other way. If you don't have a good handle on what's the allowed software, or if you're in an environment where for whatever reason you can't restrict people's software, they need to be able to customize things, or they're off. They need some kind of autonomy. You're going to use the blacklist. You're going to say this is what we're going to prohibit. Like a web filter is often an example of a blacklist, right? You'll sit there and people say we don't want people to go to social media, so they'll open the firewall up and they'll just block the major social media companies, because that's easier than trying to make a whitelist for all the web pages they want people to go to, because they want people to. You need to be able to go where you need to be able to go on the internet. So it doesn't make sense to whitelist people down to, even if it was 500 websites, that would be a huge list. So in that case, the blacklist is the shorter list, so they go with that. Usually that's what you want to do. Is you want to go with the shorter lists.
That makes sense. The shorter list is definitely going to be the least, like in the cases that you just referenced, it'll be the least intrusive to everybody's workflow and the most cost-effective way of managing this list, whether it's a whitelist or a blacklist. So,
and that's why I say that they're kind of two sides of the same coin, because generally which one you go with is whichever one is shorter. So if you're going to, I'm going to go with whitelisting because I want no one to do anything that I don't explicitly permit. is great when that list is small. But if that list starts to become big and everybody has to go through an approval process, right? That's the con for a whitelist, right? Is if you need to make a new exception, there has to be some kind of exception process where somebody says, "Hey, I need to use this software," or "I need to go to this website." Google got blocked for some reason. I don't know why, and they have to tell somebody, "Hey, I need to use this." It has to get approved. Then that person has to go and update the whitelist to let it go through. So there ends up being work on that. Whereas the blacklist, this is what's prohibited, and you guys go and do your business. Flip side of the coin for blacklisting is, again, whatever is not on the blacklist is permitted. So you're playing whack-a-mole, right? You're always having to add to the blacklist, adding in new things that you've discovered need to be prohibited because people are just doing everything that's not on the blacklist.
So what should your organization do is the one question that we have that we'll kind of delve into here. There's multiple questions that need to be asked. Number one, what kind of company culture? We talk about culture and company culture on this podcast quite a bit, but what kind of company culture do you have? There's no right or wrong way to answer that question. But what matches up in your company culture? What maturity model or compliance model does your company need to follow? And kind of an overarching question, a kind of philosophical question is, what would my customers be wanting me to do, right? Because we have customer data and customer just stuff in our systems. What would my customers be wanting me to do? Whether they know or not know ever, just what would they be wanting me to do? So I want to open up the floor. I know Jose, Crane, anybody else wants to jump in here. Depending on what kind of requirements your company has to be able to operate and work and make money, culture, what compliance models we have to follow that will actually allow us to stay in business and acquire the clients that we want. There's all sorts of different ways to present this question of what should we do and how should we do it, or should we even do it? So kind of open up the floor and kind of let's answer that question. What should your organization do, and what are some thoughts that we have to apply that question?
Well, if your company needs to have something that runs that's not necessarily secure, you need to have a policy in place that people follow. It's not necessarily going to be 100%, but you're going to need to do something in order to protect yourself from that vulnerability. So it's imperative that you have buy-in from the entire staff that works within that office, and that they understand the importance of the policy that you are going to put in place. And that's if your line of business application, if there is no hope in segregating it away from the rest of the network, if it's vulnerable to security concerns. So having a policy in place is definitely something that you want to have. If you need to have something running that's not necessarily within the security landscape that you're trying to establish. On the flip side, if you have the budgetary means, there's always a way. Where there's a will, there's a way. There's ways to segregate programs away from the rest of the network, put them in an enclave, and have them away from the network, from the internal network that's running. But most people don't have those types of budgets, and they have to work with what they have. So
yeah, it's interesting, Jose. You talk about a software that's not squeaky clean on security and the budget requirements. That's really where the big challenge, I think, for whitelisting and blacklisting for anything, for the firewall, for your web access, for a VPN, for software, anything that you're using this under, that's always the big challenge, is somebody at the organization has to work out what's permitted and what's prohibited and what's necessary for the line of business application. And for some businesses, that's a challenge, and it's eye opening. I did a security assessment for a client. They had a software whitelist of 14 items, right? They had 14 pieces of software. And I went in and I'm checking these, 20 people's computers, and I've got 200 pieces of software. And everyone's going, oh, well, we're just using the authorized software. So, well, what's all this other stuff you guys have? Like, it's not, oh, we need that. This is necessary for this reason. This is necessary for this reason. And like they didn't have a handle on it. So that can be a big challenge. We talk a lot about, organizational maturity, on this podcast. And that's really where you as a business leader, the listeners, as business leaders, as IT leaders, whatever your role in the company is, you got to get a handle on what everyone needs to do their job first. And that doesn't need to be expensive. That can be as simple as once you get buy-in from upper management, or if you are upper management, you can just direct it and ask everyone in the company, hey, what software do you guys need to use to do your jobs? And they'll tell you, oh, I use this for this, I use this for that. And then you can look at it. Then you can have your cybersecurity specialist, your CIO, CISO, whoever you have in the organization, and say, this is what we're using. Do we need to blacklist items from here? Do we need to whitelist items from here? Like, what's the best way forward? And then that person's going to have data to work with. And they might look at it and say, hey, we're using 4 different pieces of software to do one task. Let's pick one or pick 2 that work together well and get everyone on the same page for that. And you'll get lots of pushback from the organization, because whoever uses the ones that you don't authorize is going to swear up and down it's the only way they can do their job. And it's a huge cultural shift to move from this sort of everyone does whatever they want to some kind of standardization. And that's why organizationally, you might end up with a blacklist. You might say, well, you can use what you want, but don't use these ones that our IT says are insecure. So whatever you do, don't use this.
I think that's a great point, Josh. Knowing what you have inside of the organization is the key element in developing a plan of attack in order to facilitate those white and black lists that you need to have. So I think that's the number one important item to look at whenever you're, I guess, a mature organization would look at.
And the lists aren't, they're not static lists. They're gonna be dynamic. They might change slowly. It might change yearly. It might change weekly, depending on what it is. And it's not, I guess I really should have clarified this in the beginning. You can do both. You can have a whitelist and a blacklist for the same thing. A simple example, like Sid brought up the email earlier. When you get an email and you block an email, that sender, that domain goes into a blacklist. You can also get something that comes in, you have a spam filter, and it says, hey, I think this is spam. And it goes to your junk folder. You go to the junk folder and you say, hey, this is not spam. I want this email. Then it goes into a whitelist. So your email is actually running both, right? There's the whitelist that's always permitted, the blacklist that's always prohibited, and then the body of everything else that's in neither category.
That's also a good point, Josh. You can have a black and a white list at the same time.
That's really where we're talking very high level here, but that's really where organizations need to make decisions that work best for them. There's no right or wrong answer. There's no white lists are better than black lists. Black lists are terrible. right? It's what your organization needs, because the goal is to get control over how things are being run in your company, in the IT, how technology is being used. And just to segue into, the maturity model, compliance models, this is something, as your organization matures, as your organization moves through cybersecurity maturity, that will become a part of your information security and cybersecurity systems, where you have what's called authorized software, authorized processes. And the flip side, you're going to have unauthorized processes, unauthorized use of system.
Can I pose a quick question to you, Josh, around what you just were talking about? There are so many companies out there that do not need to follow a specific maturity model or compliance model. And I understand and totally get the reason to just say, I don't need this. I don't need to follow it. My company works just fine. We don't need to do this. But what are the advantages of taking the time or even spending a little? I mean, again, small companies, they're not going to be spending too much money on this because of just their natural size. What is the advantage of attempting to go through and, as Jose mentioned, find out what we have, what our users are using, and design policies around all of that, just so that we have it? Because I know that just knowing what I know and business valuation, if someone ever wanted to sell a company one day, having policies and procedures in place increases the value of a company, period. Because if you're selling it to somebody that does not have any written policies and procedures to go off of after the sale, it's the Wild West, right? Whereas if there is policies and procedures in place, then it increases the value of that company, because anybody can buy it and keep the ship going with basically a manual of how the company's supposed to run. But I wanted to open it up to you guys to kind of delve into, even if you don't have to comply to a specific compliance model or maturity model, talk about some more advantages of why folks should do it.
Yeah, every company has a risk model, risk tolerance, even if they don't have it written down. And knowing the security loopholes, having an overarching plan that takes into account your security holes. I mean, you're going to have some. There's no company out there that's 100% secure. But if you don't know, then you can't plug those holes. Or you can't say, okay, so we need to use this software. It's gonna cause this, but here's what we can do to defend against that. And so you just have to know. You have to know what your network, what your software you're using, and what your users are doing on their computers in order to facilitate and have a good plan to defend against those inadequacies when it comes to security. But if you don't know them, you're not gonna be able to plug them.
Yeah, I mean that's the number one thing, is just having eyes on things. There's so much value just in having a map of your system, how it works together, what your tech stack looks like that everyone's using. So even if you didn't have, a outside entity telling you about whitelisting and blacklisting, which coming down the pike, with cyber insurance policies, the NIST framework, PCI compliance, ISO 27001, information security management system frameworks, it's coming down, where it's going to be everyone ought to be doing this because it's a good idea. So why is it a good idea if we're not required to do it? you will actually find that you will save money. Because what happens, and this takes a little bit of time for companies, to get there, but what happens when there's no control over what people are using and how they're doing things is you'll end up with a number of parallel systems and parallel business processes. Some of those are going to be, subscription fees that you're paying software licensing fees for. We have a client that we're working with improving their tech stack, and they have one of their business processes ties in with 4 pieces of software. And depending on where you are in the company, it's either the greatest thing that the company ever decided to use, or it's the worst thing and you hate it and you use something else. And they literally have problems moving their data between these 4 systems that don't communicate. So that's an opportunity right there for savings. You can look at them, get with your team, pros and cons of each one, and then pick one and get rid of the other 3. That's going to save you money. There's, as I was saying, there's the risk, right? There's the security risk. The more pieces you have, just, the more risk there is, the more things that can break. Everyone knows a complicated machine breaks more than a simple machine, just because there's more things to break. That's more downtime for you. That's more cost for you. That's more man hours used fixing things for your company. Those might be invisible costs, right? You might not know you're even spending that money until you go out and get some of these inventories done. And then it's just the risk to your business, right? If you don't have any control over what people are using, what they're doing, you don't know what websites they're going to. You don't know what they're downloading. You don't know what they're installing to run. I've seen viruses, Trojans on people's computers because they downloaded an app to make their screen change color at night. That the screen would go like that amber color. You know what I'm talking about? The screen light saving. They downloaded software to do that, and that software had malware in it. Now they had a huge cyber incident. And you want to go to that person, you want to say, hey, you're not allowed to download that software. Well, actually, yeah, that's a blacklist or a whitelist. If you haven't told them that they can't, then they can. So now we're into, are we going to say, oh, you can't download that software because it's on the blacklist, or are we going to say, hey, don't download anything that's not on our whitelist? But again, to get that whitelist, we have to get a hold on what we need. So you end up right back where you were.
Yep, you got to have a direction for staff to follow, and if they do not have a direction, they will do rogue things, and most of the time, those rogue things are the things that'll get you in trouble. It's no secret that the human element is typically the element that allows that ransomware to come into your network. It's proven time and time again.
Absolutely. And it's funny, this, business people listening to us and they're thinking, I haven't had an incident. It's funny because I would say the vast majority
Who they know.
that they know of, right? So the vast majority of those actions that users take don't have incidents, but almost all incidents come from these sorts of unauthorized activities or activities that should be unauthorized. So that's really, I think that's the kernel of it. Is the majority of the time, it might work out okay. But when it doesn't work out, when something happens, it's almost always because of something that you should have already prevented. And just to wrap up, because we talked a lot about applications and firewalls and some tech things, and we touched on it, but just to put a spotlight on something that we talked about earlier, it doesn't need to be a software enforced, like a technology enforced list. You could, on the cheap, make a simple whitelist. You go to your employees, what do you use? They say, we use X, Y, and Z, assuming that you don't already know what they use. And then you go into Word, make a document, say, my company's authorized software list. Software A, software B, software C. All other software is prohibited. Users may not download the software. Boom. You now have a whitelist.
Correct. Real simple.
Real simple.
Yeah. There's no firewall protection. There's no gimmicky gadgets that are going to do that for you. It's your own policy, something written, something you've talked about, something you've had meetings for, that will drive that process into your staff's minds. It also will drive better productivity, because the more tools you have, you think, all these tools everybody's using, all the software, whatever other stuff they're using inside of the network, it typically doesn't mean they're more productive. It usually means you're less productive, because you're having these desegregated communications with the rest of your internal staff, and you're never really, like, for instance, if somebody's using Box, somebody's using Dropbox, another person's using OneDrive, it's desegregated. You're putting files in one place, you're telling somebody to go there, then they're like, oh man, I can't get to that. Oh, I'll email it to you. Like, there's an extra step in the process if you don't have an actual policy in place that controls that ebb and flow.